The crisp autumn morning painted Manhattan in shades of amber and gold as Natasha Reid stood before the towering steel and glass monument that was Sterling Global Enterprises. At 28, she'd built a reputation as one of the most sought-after interpreters in the business world, fluent in 7 languages and counting. Today marked the beginning of her new position as head of international communications, a role that would put her at the center of multi-million-dollar negotiations spanning continents. She adjusted the strap of her leather portfolio and took a deep breath. The lobby's soaring ceiling and minimalist design spoke of wealth and power, much like the man who commanded it all from the 50th floor. Dominic Sterling's reputation preceded him, brilliant, ruthless, and completely dedicated to building his empire. Business magazines called him the Ice King of Wall Street, a 35-year-old self-made billionaire who'd transformed his father's modest trading company into a global powerhouse. Natasha's heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way through security. The morning briefing was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp, and she'd given herself plenty of time to navigate the unfamiliar building. Or so she thought. The elevator deposited her on what she believed was the 48th floor, where the international division was housed. But as she wandered through increasingly luxurious corridors, doubt crept in. The walls here were adorned with original artwork, rather than the corporate photography she'd seen on the lower levels. The carpet beneath her feet felt thicker, more expensive. Natasha glanced at her watch. 8:55. Her stomach churned with anxiety. She'd reviewed the building directory 3 times last night, but somehow she'd gotten turned around. The morning coffee she'd gulped down was now making its presence urgently known, adding physical discomfort to her growing panic. When she spotted a door with what appeared to be a restroom symbol etched in frosted glass, relief flooded through her. She pushed through without hesitation, her mind already racing ahead to finding the conference room before she was officially late. The space that greeted her was nothing like any corporate bathroom she'd ever seen. Soft lighting emanated from recessed fixtures, casting a warm glow over walls of honey-colored wood and cream-colored stone. The air carried the soothing scent of sandalwood and fresh eucalyptus. A small waterfall trickled somewhere nearby, its sound mixing with classical piano music that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Natasha froze, her professional instincts finally catching up with her panicked state. This wasn't a public restroom. This was someone's private sanctuary. "Oh no," she whispered, backing toward the door. "This is not happening." The sound of running water stopped abruptly from somewhere deeper in the suite. Natasha's heart slammed against her ribs as she spun toward the exit, but her nervous fingers fumbled with the door handle. Before she could make her escape, footsteps approached from around a corner of frosted glass. And then he appeared. Dominic Sterling emerged from what must have been a private shower area. A charcoal gray towel wrapped low around his waist and nothing else. Water droplets traced paths down his chest, following the defined lines of muscle that spoke of disciplined gym sessions despite his demanding schedule. His dark hair, usually perfectly styled in every photo she'd seen, was wet and slightly tousled, softening the sharp angles of his face. Time crystallized into a single, mortifying moment. Their eyes locked, his a striking shade of slate gray that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed professional facade. Natasha watched recognition dawn on his features, followed by confusion, and then something that might have been irritation. "This is a private executive facility," he said, his voice carrying the controlled authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Despite his state of undress, he exuded complete command of the situation. "Care to explain what you're doing here?" Natasha's mind went blank. Every carefully prepared introduction, every practiced first impression she'd rehearsed, evaporated like morning mist. She was acutely aware of how this looked. Her first day. And she'd somehow managed to barge into the CEO's private spa while he was showering. She started, then stopped, forcing herself to take a breath. "I was looking for the restroom." "I'm new here, and I got turned around." The words came out in a rush, and she could feel heat flooding her cheeks. "I thought this was... I didn't realize..." One dark eyebrow arched upward, a gesture that managed to convey both skepticism and displeasure. The employee facilities are on the 46th floor. This level is restricted access only. He reached for a robe hanging on a nearby hook, shrugging it on without breaking eye contact. Security should have made that clear. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Sterling," Natasha said, finally finding her professional voice despite her mortification. "I'm Natasha Reed, your new head of international communications. It's my first day and I was trying to get to the morning briefing on time and She cut herself off before she could ramble further. "There's really no excuse. I should have paid better attention to where I was going." Something shifted in his expression. The irritation didn't disappear, but it was joined by a flicker of recognition. "Reed, you're the one with the credentials from the Geneva Summit. 7 languages, top marks from Columbia, commendations from 3 Fortune 500 companies." "Yes, sir." Natasha was surprised he knew her background. "Though right now I feel less like a qualified professional and more like someone who should have studied building layouts instead of Mandarin dialects." The corner of his mouth twitched, but whether with amusement or further annoyance, she couldn't tell. "The briefing starts in 4 minutes. I suggest you find your way to the correct floor quickly, Ms. Reed. Room 4810. Take a left out of the elevator, straight down the hall. The restrooms you're looking for are directly across from the conference room." "Of course. Right away." Natasha turned toward the door, grateful for the escape route, but in her haste, her heel caught on the transition between the plush carpet and polished stone floor. She stumbled forward, her arms instinctively reaching out to catch herself. Her palm landed flat against Dominic Sterling's chest. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Through the fabric of his robe, she could feel the warmth of his skin and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, stronger and faster than his composed exterior suggested. His hand had automatically moved to steady her, his fingers wrapping around her elbow with surprising gentleness. Natasha's eyes flew up to meet his, and in that suspended moment, something passed between them. It wasn't just embarrassment or professional awkwardness. It was something electric. Something that made her breath catch and her skin tingle where they touched. His pupils dilated slightly, and she saw his jaw tighten as if he were carefully maintaining control. "I'm sorry," she breathed, pulling away as though his touch had burned her. "This is absolutely not how I intended to make my first impression." The intensity in his eyes remained for another second before his professional mask slammed back into place. "No, I imagine it wasn't," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We'll discuss your navigation skills later, Ms. Reed. For now, you have exactly 3 minutes to get to that meeting." Natasha nodded mutely and fled from the room, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She found the stairs, not trusting her flustered state with elevator buttons, and hurried down 2 flights. True to his word, the conference room was exactly where he'd said it would be. She slipped into a seat just as the senior management team began filing in, trying to compose herself. Her cheeks still felt flushed, and she couldn't shake the sensation of Dominic Sterling's heartbeat beneath her palm or the way his eyes had locked onto hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with professional displeasure. What she didn't know, as she opened her tablet and prepared to take notes, was that 2 floors above, Dominic Sterling stood by the window of his private suite, staring out at the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. For the first time in years, something had managed to crack through the carefully maintained walls he'd built around himself. He pressed his palm against his chest where her hand had landed, as if he could still feel the warmth of her touch. This was going to be a problem, he realized. Natasha Reed was going to be a problem. Whether that was something to worry about or something to explore remained to be seen. The leather chair in Natasha's new office was still stiff, the desk bare except for her laptop and a single potted succulent she'd brought from home. She'd barely had time to settle in before the first challenge arrived. A sharp knock on her door frame made her look up. Marcus Chen, Dominic Sterling's executive assistant, stood there holding a stack of folders that looked alarmingly thick. "Ms. Reed, Mr. Sterling needs these translated by end of day," Marcus said, setting the stack on her desk with an audible thump. "Contracts in German, Japanese, and French. Legal terminology, so accuracy is paramount." He paused, adjusting his glasses. He was quite specific about the deadline. Natasha glanced at her watch. It was already 2 in the afternoon. She pulled the first folder toward her and flipped it open, her trained eye quickly assessing the complexity. These weren't simple business letters. They were intricate merger agreements, each page dense with legal jargon and carefully negotiated clauses. "End of day," she repeated, keeping her voice steady. "That's in 4 hours." "Mr. Sterling is aware of the timeline," Marcus replied with what might have been sympathy. "He said if there are any questions, you're welcome to call his office. Though he did mention he prefers people who can work independently." After Marcus left, Natasha sat back and allowed herself one moment of frustration. This was a test. She'd been at Sterling Global for exactly 3 days since the mortifying spa incident, and Dominic Sterling clearly hadn't forgotten their awkward first meeting. Every task that landed on her desk bore his fingerprints: impossible deadlines, complex terminology, situations designed to make most people crack under pressure. Well, she thought, rolling up her sleeves, 2 could play this game. She dove into the documents with fierce concentration. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind switching seamlessly between languages as she worked. Years of training had taught her to think in multiple linguistic frameworks simultaneously, to feel the weight and rhythm of words in different contexts. But this went beyond mere translation. She needed to preserve the precise legal meanings while ensuring cultural nuances wouldn't create loopholes in different jurisdictions. At 6:30, she saved the final document and printed the complete set. At 6:45, she walked into Dominic Sterling's outer office, where Marcus was packing up for the evening. "Is he still in?" Natasha asked. Marcus looked surprised. "You finished?" "I finish what I start," she replied simply. The executive assistant buzzed through to the inner office, then nodded toward the door. "He'll see you now." Dominic's office was everything she'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city, minimalist furniture that probably cost more than her yearly salary, and an atmosphere that screamed power and control. He sat behind a massive desk of dark wood, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms as he typed something on his computer. He looked up as she entered, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered in those gray eyes. "Surprise? Interest?" It was gone before she could identify it. "Ms. Reed," he acknowledged, leaning back in his chair. "I expected these by midnight at the earliest." "I don't believe in keeping people waiting when I can help it," Natasha replied, setting the folders on his desk. "All 3 contracts. Fully translated with notations on sections that required cultural adaptation for legal compliance in each respective country." Dominic pulled the folders toward him and began reviewing her work. Natasha stood there, her heart racing despite her outward calm. She'd triple-checked everything, but standing under his scrutiny felt like being examined under a microscope. Minutes ticked by. He moved through the pages with the focus of someone who actually understood the content, not just skimming, but genuinely reading. His expression remained frustratingly neutral. Finally, he set down the Japanese contract and looked at her. "The German translation uses Verpflichtung here rather than Pflicht. Why?" Natasha had expected this. Verpflichtung implies a contractual obligation with moral weight, while Pflicht is more of a simple duty. Given the context of the partnership clause, the stronger term protects Sterling Global's interests better if the agreement is ever challenged in German courts. His eyes narrowed slightly. "And in the French version, you changed the structure of paragraph 12 entirely." The direct translation would have been grammatically correct, but culturally tone-deaf, she explained. French business contracts follow different rhetorical patterns. I maintained your exact meaning while restructuring it to match what French executives would expect to see. Otherwise, it would raise red flags during their review. Dominic sat back, fingers steepled under his chin, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You took liberties with my words." "I preserved your intent while ensuring successful execution across cultures," Natasha corrected, refusing to back down. "That's what you hired me to do." The silence stretched between them, charged with tension. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth quirked upward. Barely a smile, but more expression than she'd seen from him yet. "Most translators give me exactly what I write, even when it's wrong," he said quietly. "They're too intimidated to push back." "I'm not most translators," Natasha replied. "And if you wanted someone who would just nod and agree, you wouldn't have hired someone with my track record." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that Ice King facade. "No," he agreed, "I suppose I wouldn't have." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Natasha felt that same electric pull from their first encounter. She forced herself to look away first, glancing toward the window where the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Sterling?" "Actually, yes." He stood, moving around the desk with fluid grace. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, video conference with our Tokyo office. They're considering pulling out of the Nakamura deal, and I need you there to ensure nothing is lost in translation, literally or figuratively." "I'll be there," Natasha confirmed. "And Ms. Reed?" He was closer now, close enough that she caught the subtle scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive. "Good work today." The compliment, simple as it was, sent a warm flush through her. "Thank you, sir." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "You can call me Dominic, at least when it's just us." Natasha looked back, surprised. He'd returned to his desk but was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Dominic," she repeated, testing the name. It felt intimate somehow, crossing an invisible line. "Good night, then." "Good night, Natasha." The use of her first name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the office temperature. The next 2 weeks became a carefully choreographed dance of challenge and response. Dominic threw increasingly difficult assignments her way, last-minute conference calls with Brazilian investors, rushed translations of technical specifications. For Korean manufacturers, high-stakes negotiations with German industrialists where a single mistranslated word could cost millions. Natasha met each challenge head-on. She worked early mornings and late nights, her office light often the last one burning on the 48th floor. But she wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. During a particularly tense video call with a group of French distributors, Dominic had deliberately used an obscure financial term, watching to see if she'd stumble. Instead, Natasha had smoothly translated it while adding context that helped the French team understand the underlying strategy. She'd seen the flash of approval in Dominic's eyes, quickly masked behind his professional demeanor. The other executives began to notice her too. Victoria Huang from operations made a point of requesting Natasha for her international calls. Robert Palmer, the CFO, actually smiled at her in the elevator, a rarity for the notoriously serious number cruncher. But it was the small moments with Dominic that kept Natasha off balance. The way he'd place coffee on her desk during late-night work sessions without saying a word. How his hand would brush hers when passing documents, the contact lasting just a fraction too long to be accidental. The intensity of his gaze during meetings, watching her with a focus that had nothing to do with business. 3 weeks after her disastrous first day, everything changed during a crucial negotiation with a Swiss pharmaceutical company. Sterling Global was trying to acquire their Asian distribution rights, but the Swiss were notoriously difficult negotiators. Proud of their precision and skeptical of American business practices. The video conference was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, giving them 1 hour to close a deal that had been stalling for months. Natasha sat beside Dominic in the executive conference room, her tablet ready, mentally preparing for the rapid-fire translation ahead. The Swiss CEO, Herr Friedrich Bergmann, appeared on screen, a stern man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes. His team flanked him, equally serious. "Mr. Sterling," Bergmann began in German, "we have reviewed your latest proposal, and frankly, we are not impressed." Natasha translated smoothly, but she could feel Dominic tense beside her. This wasn't starting well. Dominic responded in English, his tone professional but firm. "We've offered above-market value and guaranteed job security for your Asian staff. I'm unclear what concerns remain." As Natasha translated, she made a split-second decision. She softened Dominic's phrasing slightly, adding a note of respect that better suited Swiss business culture. Then, as Bergman responded, she did something she'd never done before. She added context to her translation. "He says your offer feels impersonal, lacking understanding of their company's legacy," Natasha told Dominic quietly. "But he's not saying they won't negotiate. This is a test of respect." Dominic's eyes flicked to her, sharp and assessing. Then, he nodded almost imperceptibly and adjusted his approach. For the next 45 minutes, Natasha became more than a translator. She became a bridge, reading the subtle cues in Bergman's body language and word choices, guiding Dominic's responses to align with Swiss expectations while maintaining his business objectives. She'd catch Dominic's eye and give tiny nods or shakes of her head, and he'd begun trusting her judgment, adjusting his tactics accordingly. When Bergman finally smiled, a rare and genuine expression, and extended his hand through the screen. In a symbolic gesture of agreement, Natasha felt the tension drain from the room. "I look forward to working with Sterling Global," Bergman said in German. "You have a good team, Mr. Sterling, especially your young colleague here who understands that business is built on respect, not just numbers." After the call ended and the connection terminated, Dominic sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Then he turned to Natasha with an expression she'd never seen before, unguarded admiration. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "You didn't just translate, you negotiated. I preserved your interests while building the relationship they needed." "To feel comfortable," Natasha replied, suddenly very aware that they were alone in the room. "That's what good interpretation is, understanding not just words, but intention and culture." Dominic stood, and for a moment, she thought he might leave. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why did you take this job, Natasha?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "You could work anywhere. The UN, private consulting, your own firm. Why here?" The question caught her off guard with its intimacy. "Because I wanted to be challenged," she admitted. "Because I'd heard Sterling Global was where the impossible became possible. And because—" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because I'd heard the CEO was brilliant and demanding and never accepted anything less than excellence. I wanted to see if I could meet that standard. And have you?" He was very close now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. "Have I what? Met that standard?" Natasha's heart hammered against her ribs. "You tell me." For a long moment, they stood there, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Dominic's hand lifted, almost as if to touch her face, and Natasha found herself leaning in slightly, drawn by a pull she couldn't quite explain or resist. Then his phone buzzed loudly on the conference table, shattering the moment. Dominic stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place so quickly it left Natasha dizzy. He grabbed his phone, glancing at the screen. "I have another call," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Good work today, Ms. Reed. Exceptional work." The return to her formal name felt like a door closing. Natasha nodded, gathering her tablet. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." She made it to the door before his voice stopped her one more time. "Natasha?" She turned, hopeful and confused. His expression was conflicted, as if he were fighting some internal battle. "Be ready tomorrow at 7. We have the follow-up meeting with the Swiss team, and I want you leading the conversation." It wasn't what she'd hoped he might say, but it was trust. The kind of professional trust that Dominic Sterling rarely gave anyone. "I'll be ready," she promised. As she walked back to her office, Natasha pressed her hand against her chest, feeling her racing heart. Something was shifting between them, something neither of them seemed able to control. The question was whether they'd continue fighting it, or finally acknowledge what was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. The invitation had appeared in Natasha's office mailbox with elegant formality, heavy cardstock embossed with gold lettering. The Sterling Foundation Annual Charity Gala, benefiting children's literacy programs worldwide. Black tie required. The event was legendary in New York social circles, drawing celebrities, politicians, and business titans from around the globe. What made Natasha's pulse quicken wasn't the prestige of the event, but the handwritten note clipped to the invitation in Dominic's precise script. Your presence is requested. This is not optional. DS. Now, standing before her apartment mirror in a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk that she'd spent far too much money on, Natasha questioned every decision that had led to this moment. The dress hugged her curves before flowing elegantly to the floor, the color bringing out the green in her hazel eyes. She'd swept her auburn hair into a sophisticated updo, leaving a few tendrils to frame her face. You look beautiful, her roommate Jules said from the doorway, grinning. Mr. Ice King isn't going to know what hit him. It's a work event, Natasha protested, but her cheeks flushed. I'm there in a professional capacity. Right, professional, Jules laughed. That's why you've tried on 17 dresses and spent an hour on your makeup. Very professional. Natasha couldn't argue because Jules was right. In the 6 weeks since she'd started at Sterling Global, her relationship with Dominic had evolved into something she couldn't quite define. They maintained perfect professional boundaries during the day, but there were moments, lingering glances, accidental touches, conversations that strayed into personal territory before one of them pulled back. That suggested something simmering beneath the surface. The car Dominic had sent arrived precisely at 7. As Natasha slid into the back seat, she tried to calm her racing thoughts. This was just another work obligation, nothing more. The Plaza Hotel blazed with lights, its grand facade welcoming a steady stream of elegantly dressed guests. Photographers lined the entrance, flashes popping as celebrities and socialites posed for pictures. Natasha felt suddenly out of her depth. The driver opened her door, and she stepped out into the controlled chaos of the red carpet. She was looking around, trying to orient herself, when a familiar voice made her turn. Natasha. Dominic stood at the base of the stairs, and the sight of him stole her breath. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was styled back, his sharp features softened slightly by the warm lighting. But it was his eyes, those penetrating gray eyes that captured her attention. They swept over her, and something flickered in their depths that made her skin tingle. Mr. Sterling, she managed, suddenly forgetting every language she'd ever learned except the most basic English. Dominic, he corrected, moving toward her. Remember? At least for tonight. He extended his arm. Shall we? Natasha placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his jacket. They climbed the stairs together, and she tried not to notice how perfectly they seemed to fit, moving in sync as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. Inside, the ballroom was transformed into a wonderland of light and elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic rainbows across the crowd. Round tables draped in white linen surrounded a central dance floor, and a live orchestra played soft jazz from an elevated stage. The air buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages, punctuated by laughter and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. Stay close, Dominic murmured near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. There are several international donors I need you to meet. Your language skills will be invaluable. And so began an exhausting but exhilarating evening of introductions. Natasha found herself switching effortlessly between Mandarin with a Chinese tech mogul, French with a Parisian fashion designer, and Arabic with a Dubai real estate developer. Dominic watched her work with barely concealed admiration, his hand often resting lightly on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd, a touch that felt both protective and possessive. "You're magnificent," he said during a brief moment alone. They stood at the edge of the ballroom watching the crowd. watching you connect with people, making them feel understood and valued. It's extraordinary. Natasha felt warmth spread through her chest. I'm just doing my job. No, Dominic turned to face her fully, his expression intense. You're doing so much more than that. You have a gift for making people feel seen. He paused, seeming to struggle for words. It's captivating. Before Natasha could respond, a smooth voice interrupted them. Dominic Sterling, as I live and breathe. A handsome man in his 40s approached, champagne glass in hand and a knowing smile on his face. He had the casual confidence of old money and good breeding, his blonde hair perfectly styled. Dominic's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Harrison, I wasn't aware you'd be attending. Wouldn't miss it, Harrison replied, his eyes sliding to Natasha with obvious interest. Though I see you've been keeping secrets, I don't believe we've met. Harrison Blackwell, Natasha Reed, she replied, shaking his offered hand. I'm head of international communications at Sterling Global. How fascinating. Harrison held her hand a moment longer than necessary. And where has Dominic been hiding you? I thought I knew all his executives. Ms. Reed is relatively new, Dominic interjected, his tone carrying an edge Natasha had never heard before, and quite busy. We were just discussing the donors from Shanghai. Of course, business always comes first with you, doesn't it? Harrison's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Tell me, Ms. Reed, has he made you work through lunch yet? Dominic's notorious for forgetting his staff are actually human beings with basic needs. Natasha felt the tension rolling off Dominic in waves. Mr. Sterling has been nothing but professional, she said carefully. Professional. How sterile. Harrison took a sip of champagne. Perhaps you'd like a break from all that professionalism? The string quartet is quite good, and I'd love to hear more about your work. Dance with me? He extended his hand to Natasha, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Refusing seemed rude, but accepting felt like betrayal, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Actually, Dominic's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Ms. Reed promised me the next dance. Didn't you, Natasha? His eyes met hers, and she saw something there. A question, a plea, and something deeper that made her heart skip. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I did. Dominic's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt far more intimate than professional. Excuse us, Harrison. He led her on to the dance floor as the orchestra transitioned into a slow waltz. Natasha's breath caught as Dominic's arm slid around her waist, pulling her close. His hand was warm against the silk of her dress, and she could feel the solid strength of him as they began to move. I apologize for that, Dominic said quietly, his lips near her ear so she could hear him over the music. Harrison and I have history. He has a talent for finding pressure points. What kind of history? Natasha asked, allowing herself to relax into his lead. He moved with surprising grace, guiding her effortlessly through the steps. We competed for the same acquisition 5 years ago. He won by using questionable tactics, cost Sterling Global millions, and me a considerable amount of pride. Dominic's jaw tightened. He's never let me forget it. And is that why you pulled me away? To deny him a small victory? Dominic was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it. No, I pulled you away because I couldn't stand watching him touch you. Because the thought of you dancing with him made me irrationally angry. Because... He paused, and Natasha felt his hand tighten slightly on her waist. Because I wanted you here, with me. Natasha's heart thundered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She pulled back slightly to look at his face, searching those gray eyes for answers to questions she was afraid to ask. Dominic, she whispered. What are we doing? His gaze intensified, and for a moment, she saw past all his carefully constructed walls to something raw and uncertain beneath. I don't know, he admitted. I hired you because you were the best. I've been testing you because I needed to prove you were just another employee, nothing special. But you keep surprising me, keep showing me layers I didn't expect. And now? Now? She prompted, barely breathing. Now I can't stop thinking about you, he confessed. About that first morning in the spa when you literally fell into my arms. About the way you light up when you're translating, completely in your element, about how you challenge me and make me laugh and see things differently. I shouldn't. We can't. But God help me, Natasha, I can't seem to stay away from you. The music swelled around them, and Natasha felt as if they were the only two people in the crowded ballroom. Every nerve ending was alive, hyper-aware of where their bodies touched, where his breath ghosted across her skin. I think about you too, she admitted. More than I should. More than is wise. Dominic's eyes darkened. This is dangerous territory. I know. There are policies, professional boundaries, power dynamics to consider. I know, Natasha repeated. We should stop this before it goes any further. Should we? She asked, and something in her tone, part challenge, part invitation, made his breath catch. The song ended, and they stood there, still swaying slightly, neither willing to break the contact. Around them, other couples moved apart, but Dominic's arm remained around her waist, his hand still holding hers. Dominic! A sharp female voice cut through the moment. They turned to see Victoria Huang approaching, her expression apologetic but urgent. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation. The Singapore investors just arrived unexpectedly, and they're asking for you immediately. Reality crashed back in. Dominic released Natasha, professional distance snapping into place so abruptly it left her cold. Where are they? The East Lounge. I've had staff prepare refreshments, but they seemed agitated. Dominic nodded, then turned to Natasha. I need you there. They prefer speaking Mandarin for sensitive discussions. Of course, Natasha replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They followed Victoria through the crowd, slipping back into their professional roles as if the previous moments hadn't happened. But as they walked, Dominic's hand brushed against Natasha's, and his pinky finger hooked briefly around hers, a small gesture, hidden from everyone else, that promised their conversation wasn't over. The meeting with the Singapore investors lasted nearly an hour. Natasha translated rapid-fire discussions about market concerns and investment risks, her mind split between the complex business negotiations and the memory of Dominic's confession on the dance floor. When they finally resolved the investors' concerns and returned to the ballroom, the gala was winding down. Guests were beginning to depart, staff quietly clearing tables. The orchestra had been replaced by a pianist playing soft, melancholic melodies. I should go, Natasha said, spotting Jules texting her about a ride home. It's late. Let me drive you, Dominic offered. My car is already here. They rode through the city streets in comfortable silence, the partition up between them and the driver. Manhattan glowed outside the windows, alive with Friday night energy despite the late hour. When they pulled up outside Natasha's apartment building in the West Village, Dominic walked her to the door, a gentlemanly gesture that felt loaded with significance. Thank you for tonight, she said, turning to face him under the soft glow of the street lamp. For everything. Natasha, Dominic began, then stopped, seeming to war with himself. What I said earlier on the dance floor, don't, she interrupted gently. Don't take it back. Not tonight. He studied her face, and she watched the battle play out in his eyes. Duty versus desire, professional distance versus personal connection. Finally, he reached out and tucked a loose tendril of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The touch was feather-light but sent electricity racing through her entire body. Good night, Natasha, he said softly. Good night, Dominic. She watched him walk back to the car, watched it pull away into the night. Then she let herself into the building, leaning against the door once it closed behind her, her heart still racing. Everything had changed tonight. Lines had been crossed, words spoken that couldn't be unspoken. Monday morning would bring reality crashing back, office policies, professional ethics, the complicated dance of being employer and employee. But for now, in the quiet of the ending night, Natasha allowed herself to smile. Because for the first time since she'd walked into that private spa 6 weeks ago, she knew with absolute certainty that Dominic Sterling felt exactly what she felt. What they would do about it was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she simply let herself feel the warmth of possibility.